Well, I can't think of a better way than to start this conference with a good friend of ours, and that is Dave Csinos. He's all the way from Canada, and he's just been an incredible voice in this space. He's a great friend. I'm going to read all his qualifications because I can't put them to memory. They're just so full on, and I don't want to get them wrong. As he shakes his head, I can see you, David. He's an associate professor of practical theology in Atlantic School of Theology in Halifax, Canada. He's the president and the founder of Faith Forward, an ecumenical network for innovation in ministry with children, youth and families. He writes and speaks widely across the intergenerational space and experimental ministry. And his book, Little Theologians, and the 3-volume Faith Forward series is available. But his newest book, which is coming, which I'm really excited about personally, is A Gospel for All Ages, Teaching and Preaching with the Whole Church. And that will be released in May 2022, which seems like a long way away, but we'll get there. But anyway, I'm going to hand over to Dave, and I can't wait to hear what you have to share with us, because we're all empty now and ready for you to fill us with your thoughts. Go for it.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I am coming from the traditional land of the Mi'kmaq, who are for many centuries the caretakers of what is now Eastern Canada, different provinces of Atlantic Canada, including Nova Scotia and the city of Halifax, where I am living right now. I'm ready to go. I wish I was in Australia. I brought Tim Tams because I need Tim Tams. Last time I was in Australia, we had Tim Tams at the conference, and I wanted to get pavlova, but I thought, I know there's Aussies here, there's Kiwis here, and it's a very divisive dessert, I hear, because I'm not quite sure where it originated, and I'm not going to get into that today, because even though Tammy said the whole safe space glass houses thing, some topics are just too difficult to broach. I am a professor at Atlantic School of Theology, and so I really appreciated your story to start things off, Tammy, because I see myself in that role, although I try to leave some space in the cup for new things, because I love research, and I am going to share with you some research that I have done in the past couple of years. I'm going to just share my screen first. There we go. Can you see that? Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, I love research. And I always have. From a young age, I always found there was something immensely satisfying about digging through a book, learning everything I can about a particular topic, and putting what I've learned together in some sort of medium for sharing it. My parents' basement is full of boxes of projects from my primary and secondary school years in Sudbury, Ontario. There's the killer guitar made from plywood and fishing line that sounded terrible. The scroll that unravels to reveal a detailed cross-section of a medieval castle. And the haunted house that I built out of a simple cardboard box covered in kitty litter for that high-quality year 4 imitation stucco effect. I was destined to be a researcher. And when I decided to undertake research into intergenerational preaching and teaching, I wanted to do more than just read about Christian proclamation, read about intergenerational formation, and put the two together in some sort of resource that I could call my own. And so what I'm going to share with you is the part of the fruits of that research, but it's a small part of the much bigger project that will come out next year, as Tammy said, as a gospel for all ages. And Tammy actually has a contribution to the book. The book is going to feature 6 contributions from practitioners from different countries who are actually experimenting with intergenerational preaching. It was actually supposed to be available this spring, but Tammy took so long to get her contribution in that we pushed it back a year. I'm completely joking. Tammy is the easiest person to get things back from. So what I was really keen on learning about in this project, though, is what practitioners from the front lines of ministry were doing as part of their own experimentations with intergenerational preaching, with proclaiming the gospel in faith communities of all ages. So I created an online survey, and I sent it to friends and colleagues who then sent it to their friends and colleagues, and so on and so on, with the request that they fill it out if they consider what they do intergenerational preaching. So I'm going to draw from the wisdom of these pastors and these lay leaders who responded to this survey and identify 8 core characteristics, 8 hallmarks of their approaches and styles and methods for intergenerational preaching. Now, these aren't concrete, specific practices and tactics for preaching the gospel in all age parishes and all age congregations. So if you want something that's a little more concrete, a little more practical, at the end of this presentation, you can check out a recording of the webinar I offered last summer through Intergenerate Australia that's on their website. What I want to talk about today are the assumptions, the attitudes, the postures that clear a path and guide us as we experiment with intergenerational preaching. But I want to offer a few caveats, a few disclaimers. First, you'll notice I'm using language that refers to preaching. And there is much wisdom, not only in preaching in what I've learned, but also in teaching. So this is about preaching and teaching intergenerationally. And in fact, I presented about this research at the US-based Intergenerate conference just a couple months ago. And after my presentation, someone asked me how I define preaching and teaching and what the difference is between the two. And I rambled my way through a non-answer. Because truth be told, even though I have thought a lot about this over the past few years, I didn't know what to say. And I still don't. Preaching and teaching are 2 distinct pastoral practices. But the desire to distinguish and dissect them, to distinguish and dissect anything in order to understand it, comes out of Western epistemologies, Western ways of knowing. Many other cultural norms would say that they weren't so concerned with differentiating between preaching and teaching. And I think there's wisdom in this way of seeing and living in the world. So whether you're ordained or lay, whether you are a preacher or a teacher or neither, I invite you to don a very broad lens for this conversation and have very wide views for what counts as preaching and teaching in intergenerational contexts. And a second very brief caveat, you are involved in intergenerational preaching. You may not get up in the pulpit, you may not say anything publicly, but if you are part of a worship service, if you are part of a community of faith that proclaims the gospel and hears that gospel proclaimed, you are involved in this process. And as we're going to see, intergenerational preaching involves everyone. So this is for you. And finally, one more caveat. Some of the ideas I'm going to share might be a little radical for you and your context, and that's okay. But please keep in mind that they emerged from the actual practice on the ground of intergenerational preachers. And so these were not thrust upon churches, but these are ideas that developed below the surface through years of good pastoral practice. So let's get into these 8 hallmarks. First, the gospel's for everyone. I mean, we know this. The best thinkers and the best practitioners of both preaching and intergenerational formation uphold a common key assumption. The gospel is for everyone. Fred Craddock makes this clear in his now classic book just called Preaching, when he says that preaching reveals God by being shouted from the housetop. This is a metaphorical way of speaking of the fact that no one should be excluded from the proclamation of the gospel. When we shout it from the housetop, everyone can hear. Now, this is a fundamental value echoed and enacted by intergenerational preachers. One survey respondent from the UK wrote this: children and young people should be included as fellow pilgrims, full and equal members of any community of faith. As full members, people of all ages ought to hear the shouts of the gospel. And better still, they ought to have a role in making it heard in their own way, of sharing that gospel with others. Of course, the elders among us have much to proclaim about God's love and God's faithfulness to the young. But it was actually Jesus himself who said that even little children have important contributions to make in the church's common mission to proclaim the gospel. A respondent from Australia said it this way: every voice and generation should be invited to speak into our community's discernment and worship. Now, that other practitioner from the UK, this person went on to say something that young people and all people should be full and equal participants in congregations. Affirming God's call to everyone to both speak and to hear the gospel means not only are we full members of the church, but we are equal as disciples of Christ. Homiletician, which is a scholar of preaching, Wesley Allen, he has a vision of preaching that says it's part of the ongoing and unending conversation of a faith community. And it's founded on an ethic that implies an egalitarian view of community in which all conversation partners are equally valued and all voices are welcome around the table. Preachers and other congregational leaders may be educated, credentialed, ordained, authorized to speak the gospel among our communities. Some might not be these things and still do it anyway. But the utterances of the ordained preacher are no less valuable than those of the 5-year-old child or the 95-year-old senior who are among those people gathered that day. The Spirit has empowered us all with gifts to use to manifest God's love in the world. Hallmark number 1, the gospel's for everyone. Now, if you've ever tried to learn a new language, you know that whether you're learning French or Swahili or Koine Greek or Klingon, that one thing is true. You have to start at the beginning. No one benefits by learning unusual words or curse words or overly complex grammatical rules. And of course, these rules have countless exceptions on day one. What we do is we start with simple, everyday words. Hello, bonjour, hola, salut. Preaching the gospel with all ages means we pay close attention to the language we're using. Because some members of the congregation, because of their age, their culture, their nationality, their ability, some of them are going to have a more limited linguistic knowledge and vocabulary than others. And this is even more true when we're talking about theological language, religious language, because not everyone in the church is going to know what words like pneumatology and justification and ordinance mean in church speak. And they may not be aware of the deeply theological meaning that Christianity infuses onto common words like cross, save, justice. Scholars like Marcus Borg and Diana Butler-Bass have both argued that there's a rise of illiteracy in Christian language and in Christian meaning, even among adults who've been part of a church for most of their lives. So it's no wonder that practitioners who filled out the online survey spoke about the importance of using jargon-free language and avoiding insider terms that aren't accessible for people who are new to the church, either because they've only recently joined or they were born into it not too long ago. The language of intergenerational preaching has to reflect the egalitarian nature of everyone in the community and has to be comprehensible by everyone. Now, upholding the importance of simple language doesn't mean that we dumb down deeper and complex ideas. What it requires is that we use the advice of Rabbi Sandy Sasso, who said, when talking to our children about God, we do not need to simplify the concept. What we need is to simplify the language. Young people and new disciples know how to ask penetrating questions. They know how to consider profound ideas, but they may need to use simple language to speak about them. So we who preach should do likewise for their benefit and for the benefit of the whole church. Now, our formation as disciples of Jesus is a lifelong quest. Even Peter, the disciple, had much to learn after Jesus charged him and the rest of the disciples with taking up the baton of gospel proclamation. The 10th chapter of the book of Acts recounts how, as a leader in the early Jesus movement, Peter needed to have his imagination expanded And he needed to develop eyes to see that God had already destroyed the barriers of inclusion, barriers that were destroyed in this new community called the body of Christ. Peter's journey of discipleship didn't end when he became a key holder. It was through encounters with newer, dare we say younger, disciples that pushed him deeper and deeper into his own walk with Jesus. Intergenerational approaches to preaching are founded on the radical idea that that people of all ages can teach each other and learn from each other. This mutuality is reminiscent of Paulo Freire's idea that through dialogue, the teacher of the students and the students of the teacher cease to exist and a new term emerges. Teacher-student with students-teacher. They become jointly responsible for a process in which all grow. When everyone takes on roles as both teachers and learners, no exceptions, we can form one another as we walk arm in arm on the path of discipleship. Now, this is something else that one minister from Australia made clear in her response to my questionnaire. She said, "We learn from each other and we teach each other. No one generation has all the answers and insights. God showers the gift of faith on everyone. And while differences among generations and other characteristics as well might be apparent, these differences are actually potent with much insight for growing in our God-given faith. Both the wide-eyed child and the doubt-filled adolescent, and even the discerning elder, all reveal clues about what it means to form and what it means to be formed together as we follow Jesus." Now, alongside the growing trend of Christian illiteracy I mentioned is a rise in biblical illiteracy. The problem isn't just a lack of knowledge about the Bible. Sometimes the relationships that we have with our holy texts, how we understand the Bible, is unhealthy. It's dysfunctional. It can be even downright toxic. Brian McLaren stated this pointedly when he likened the Bible, or more likely when he likened harmful uses of the Bible, to a loaded gun. We've got loaded weapons in our nightstands in the Gideon Bible. Words that have been used to harm Jews, Aboriginal peoples, women, LGBTQ people, Muslims, and others. We need to find and unload the weapons that are lying around our ecclesial households, and we must remove toxic, hostile elements from our theological identities for our own spiritual health, and of course for the well-being of the other as well. Like all forms of good preaching, intergenerational proclamation centers on the Bible, and it seeks to connect the work of God with the work of God that we read about in the Bible's pages, with the work of God we see around us in our world. But how we see the Bible's role in preaching, how we see the Bible's role in the life of faith at all, must never be as a weapon of coercion. Rather, it can be something more life-giving. Maybe we can see it as a meal prepared by God and shared by friends, as a toolbox for building faith in any situation, or as a conversation partner with whom we can wrestle ideas and practices. Preaching the gospel among communities of all ages calls us to loosen our ideological stranglehold on unhelpful understandings of the inerrancy of Scripture and place the Bible at the center of our community for everyone to interact with in their own ways. Just look at the words that leaders who responded to my questionnaire used when they described the importance of the Bible in their intergenerational preaching practices. They used the words engage, wrestle, question, explore. The Bible isn't a delicate porcelain figure. It's not like that china that Tammy showed us earlier, that we have to keep away from children. It's rugged, it's durable, it's tenacious. These are the qualities that have allowed the Bible to weather the sands of time, to wrestle with and question and even doubt the sacred stories of our scriptures means that we relate to it as a wise and experienced guide on the quest of faith. Anita Clote notes that a posture of questioning is a sign of showing interest and wanting to take ownership of what's presented to you in order to integrate it within your worldview and everyday life. It's exactly this kind of interest that intergenerational preaching should ignite by inviting everyone to listen for God's voice as it calls to them from within the Bible. Now, a fifth hallmark has to do with, it's kind of related to this, because the need for recognizing the durability of the Bible rests in part on the fact that there are so many ways to engage with everything that's contained within its pages. Intergenerational ministry of any kind, like all other adjectives beginning with the prefix inter, implies diversity and difference. To preach the gospel among an intergenerational faith community is to make room for the good news to be heard by people of different ages and belonging to different generations. Any intergenerational community is inherently diverse, although some are diverse in many more characteristics than just age. Diversity was regularly identified as vital among the practitioners of intergenerational preaching that filled out the survey. In fact, there were actually 3 different ways that this de facto diversity within intergenerational parishes and congregation rose to the surface. And the first had to do, we can call it diversity 1. It had to do with the people in the community. This is the most obvious difference. Proponents of anything intergenerational are deeply aware of the variety of assumptions and norms and worldviews and ways of living that are present within any all-age community. But even among people of the same age, there are multiple differences that intersect among members of a group. And for this reason, one respondent wrote that their approach to all-age preaching also took account of multi-ability, multi-sensory, and multi-intelligence. Now, a second diversity had to do with the histories and the traditions of Christianity. The way we order our reading of scripture through lectionaries, how we mark time by the liturgical year and by other calendars, and the particular context of our local faith communities are all important factors that affect how we might teach and preach about the gospel. An urban congregation in a major US city that's celebrating Juneteenth on a week when the readings include Matthew 10, they're going to preach the gospel in a very different way than a rural parish in Wales will when they're stepping into Acts 2, the passage on Pentecost. And this brings us to the third diversity, how we actually go about proclaiming this gospel. Although we have different styles of preaching with which we're all more comfortable, it's crucial to use several different approaches. Not every method or every model is going to appeal to or be effective among every person every time. And so recognizing the diversity in the room and the diversity in our tradition requires us to be diverse in our preaching practices. And this brings us to our 6th hallmark. Christian proclamation is a practice. It's not a passive enterprise. Preaching the gospel requires both those who share their insights and those who listen to those insights to be actively involved in the process. There's this brilliant bishop in Sweden named Marianne Garden, and she did research into congregants' interactions with sermons. And she found that listeners take elements of the sermon and build them into their own pre-understanding. Now, we probably all knew this already because we all do it. But it's another thing to have someone who has studied this talk about just how crucial this is. And this opens up what she calls the third room of preaching. And she names it as that space that emerges when listeners actively make meaning of the messages that the preacher offers during the sermon. Active listening and concrete engagement with the thoughts and actions of others is necessary for the purposes of preaching to be fulfilled. Regardless of the style of proclamation that you may be using to invite people into God's story, to be changed by it, to open our eyes and see God's presence all around us. Now, to say that learning is an active process is hardly groundbreaking at all. Any educator worth their salt knows this at some level. Human beings grow in knowledge and ability not by passively receiving nuggets of information, but by actively participating in the learning process. Now, many respondents to the questionnaire were careful to name the fact that the approaches that they used rests on an assumption that people have to do more than just hear the gospel proclaimed. They have to experience the gospel. They have to participate in its very proclamation. The descriptions that they offer of their practices and their values were littered with terms like active, interactive, engagement, participation, experience. The combined wisdom and the vast experience of that group of respondents, they call us who are aspiring intergenerational preachers to see their ministry as inviting people of all ages to participate in the gospel, to participate in sharing that gospel with others. One respondent said intergenerational preaching is about leaving space for others to contribute. I find that really fascinating, leaving space. Sometimes I and my students in my preaching classes talk about filling the space, but we need to leave space too. And what do we leave space for? Preaching in intergenerational contexts require leaders to adapt more common monological approaches to what Doug Pagitt calls speeching and forge methods that accommodate the tremendous diversity of people in the faith community. This kind of creativity is very challenging and it is very risky because it rubs against expectations and norms, and it offers no guarantees of success, but is nothing short of what's needed when preaching for all ages. And creativity doesn't matter just for preachers, because those of us who listen to and engage with and participate in the messages and teachings that we offer also must be creative. Every person present is going to interact with what they hear and what they experience and what they explore. And they might see how it's integrated into their current thinking and their current behavior. This is how we learn and this is how we grow as human beings, by having new experiences, by being exposed to new ideas and seeing whether or not and how this experience and these ideas might fit with our current assumptions. We do this every day, and we're usually not even aware of it. This too is a manifestation of creativity because it allows new ideas to emerge and new practices to develop that didn't previously exist. Now, the first sentences of our very durable scriptures introduce a God that creates. From the sun of day and the moon of night to the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, ours is a world that exists because God breathed life into it. The spirit of creativity is infused into what we do as human beings, as people of faith, and as those called to proclaim the gospel. God is not finished creating, and it's up to us to join in the process. But what if, this is a pretty radical idea, what if God isn't just a being that creates? What if God is the very act of creating? What if God is creativity? It's this idea that theologian Gordon Kaufman proposed in the late 20th century when he argued that God is that utterly amazing mystery of serendipitous creativity, manifest through the universe from the Big Bang onward, first in cosmic and biological evolutionary developments, and then ultimately producing, in part through the emergence of human creative activity, the human world of history, culture, highly complex levels of symbolization, and elaborate technologies. This is a radical shift in how we understand a God that is beyond our understanding. If God is serendipitous creativity, it means not only that God creates, but that God is present in the very act of creation. This alternative view of God revolutionizes how we theologically understand creativity. Because rather than seeing ourselves as participants in the creative action of God, when we create new objects, ideas, and ways of living in the world, including when we create new forms of preaching, God is incarnated in the world again and again and again. Everything from writing down a new prayer to developing a new app, having a conversation from which new ideas erupt, and having an intimate moment from which a new life is conceived. This isn't just simply a sign of God's love, but it is the very God who is love. When 2 or 3 or 30 or 300 are gathered and sharing experiences of preaching the gospel, God is present in the creativity that ensues. And finally, if, as I've just said, God is present in the creative acts that are so prevalent in the approaches, in different approaches to preaching for all ages, then it stands to reason that the power of this God touches each and every one of us, created and creating beings. Let's consider the story of Pentecost as recounted in the 2nd chapter of the book of Acts. Now, the apostles have casted lots to see who God was calling to replace Judas in their band of 12. And we read that on the day of Pentecost, this new and improved group were gathered together in Jerusalem when a powerful wind blew through the room, and tongues of fire rested on each of them. And after Jesus brought a new hope in episode 4, and the empire struck back by crucifying him in episode 5, we arrive here at episode 6, the return of the Spirit. The apostles were filled with the Holy Spirit right then and right there, and they began to speak in many languages. Or did they? It was a miracle, to be sure, but it might not have been the miracle we often assume it was. Now, for many years, I saw this defining moment in the life of the church as a miracle of the tongue. Because after all, the Spirit descended on the 12 as tongues of fire and enabled them to speak as never before. But Eric Law says in a book, The Wolf Shall Dwell with the Lamb, what if this wasn't just a miracle of the tongue? What if it was a miracle of the ear? Let's read further into this chapter. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment because each one had heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, aren't all of those who are speaking Galileans? How then is it that each of us hears them in our own native language? And it continues with the part that every reader or preacher worries about, a bunch of words that are hard to pronounce. Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, residents in Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya near Cyrene. Visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs, we hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues. Take a close look at the language used to describe this miracle. Yes, the crowd mentions the act of speaking among the 12. But more often we read about the hearing of the crowd. They hear a sound. Each one heard their own language. Each of us hears them. We hear them declaring the wonders of God. Could it be that the same Spirit that gave the 12 the ability to speak in tongues also gave the crowd the ability to hear what was being spoken? This sort of perspective of the Spirit is crucial for proclaiming the gospel in intergenerational contexts. Multiple responses to the questionnaire made it clear that God's Spirit leads everyone in the community, as one person said. The same Spirit that engendered the miracle of the tongues on the day of Pentecost, the same Spirit gives all of us, you and me, regardless of age, the miraculous ability to speak and hear the voice of God shared among all members of an intergenerational community. Now, intergenerational preaching is a largely experimental endeavor. After decade upon decade of preaching that has made adults the primary, if not the only, intended audience, those who wish to bring people of every age together by proclaiming the gospel for everyone have often had to make things up as they go along. And thankfully, some of the most innovative and thoughtful practitioners from around the globe have shared about how they preach an intergenerational gospel. And I hope I have done them justice by sharing these 8 hallmarks with all of you.